As promised, this is the narrated PowerPoint for Chapter 5, Theories of Motivation. What I'm going to be doing during this narrated PowerPoint is what I consider a quick skim of each of the slides. I'll return in more detail to several of the slides when we are together face-to-face in class. Begin with the big picture. I want you to think about something that you really love to do. We talked a little bit about this in class when I asked you on the first day, or actually, I guess the second day, to identify something fun that you like to do. So right now, I'd like you to think about something that you really love to do, something that you would do without pay, something that you would love to spend many hours doing if you could. So go ahead, take a minute. It doesn't have to be the same thing that you wrote down on your index card. It can be anything you want. But go ahead and jot something down. We'll return to discussing this when we're face-to-face together. A key principle behind the topic of motivation is captured in this quote by Phil Jackson, and that is that you cannot motivate someone. All you can do is provide a motivating environment, and the players will motivate themselves. So Phil Jackson is a famous coach, considered one of the best coaches in professional basketball. And he's making an essential point here, which is that only individuals control whether they choose to be motivated. We talk all the time about, well, what are you going to do to motivate your followers? And the reality is you can't motivate them. They have to choose to motivate themselves. So the manager's task or the leader's task is to create the conditions under which followers might choose to motivate themselves. So again, as a leader, you can't motivate anybody, but what you can do is try to make it possible for people to choose to motivate themselves. Performance, remember this is 1A of our dependent variables, is a function of 3 factors. The first is motivation. You multiply that by the person's ability, and you multiply that by what's happening in the environment. So motivation, it says here, is the desire to achieve a goal or a certain performance level leading to goal-directed behavior. Motivation is all about effort. Motivation is all about choosing to direct one's attention and effort in a particular direction. And third, motivation is about persistence. So continuing to do something even when facing obstacles. So it's about effort, it's about choice, it's about persistence. Ability is having the actual skills and knowledge required to do the job, to do whatever one is being asked to do. And the environment is key. The environment includes all of the resources, the information, and the support that a person needs to perform well. Now, the multiplicative relationship is important to focus on here, to pay attention to here, to make a note of here. Essentially what it's saying is that if any of these 3 pieces is absent, well, then we should not expect to see anything in the way of performance. In other words, even if a person has a high degree of ability and a very supportive environment, if the person elects not to be motivated, yeah, they're not going to be performing. Or a person could be highly motivated and have a very supportive environment, but if they don't have the ability, well, again, performance just isn't going to happen. And then finally, a person could be very motivated, want to do well, want to put forth a great deal of effort, want to choose to direct their effort in the right direction, be willing to persist, and have a high degree of ability. But if the environment isn't what it needs to be, again, we shouldn't expect performance. Now I'm going to very quickly walk through this basic model of motivation. I will give another example when we're in class. So the basic model of motivation starts like all motivation does with an unsatisfied need. Importantly, satisfied needs do not motivate. Only unsatisfied needs motivate. That unsatisfied need that you have causes you to feel some tension, which in turn causes you to engage in goal-directed behavior. If that goal is achieved, if the answer is yes, we've achieved the goal, we move on to the next unsatisfied need. On the other hand, if we don't achieve our goal, well, then we're going to feel frustration, dissatisfaction. At that point, we can choose to engage in constructive behavior. Perhaps we try a different approach to getting our unsatisfied needs satisfied. We maybe decide now is not the right time to try and satisfy that need. Or we could engage in defensive or destructive behavior. Examples of that include withdrawal, aggression, and regression. In class, I'll give a couple of really specific examples to illustrate how this might play out. When we talk about motivation and we talk about leaders, it's important to start with each of us understanding the assumptions we make about other people and how those assumptions might influence how we treat them and therefore how they respond. So keep in mind that how the leader treats people is part of the environment aspect of performance. So it's just as important as a person's motivation. It's just as important as a person's ability. Again, the assumptions that we make about other people tend to drive how we engage with them. A guy named McGregor in 1960 put forth a theory that said that managers, leaders, actually all of us, hold two different basic assumptions about motivation and other people. One is the Theory X set. Basically, we assume that employees really don't want to work, they're lazy, they don't like responsibility, they don't want to have ownership for anything. We have to offer them carrots, little prizes, or threats of punishment, sticks, in order for them to choose to be motivated. The other set of assumptions are called Theory Y assumptions. And here, we assume that employees, our direct reports, our followers, actually want to do a good job, that they're motivated from within, intrinsically motivated, and they want responsibility. They want to do a good job. They don't need to be threatened with punishment. They basically just need an opportunity. Now, you might take some time and think about which set of assumptions do you tend to subscribe to? Do you tend to think of other people as not being terribly motivated, being pretty lazy, or do you think that most people are in fact pretty driven, pretty self-motivated, if you will? That'd be another phrase that you might use. For example, as you think about group projects that you've been a part of or teams that you've been a part of, when someone isn't pulling their share of the load, what goes through your mind? Do you, again, assume, yeah, they're just lazy? Or do you assume perhaps that something else is going on that's keeping them from contributing their best effort? We'll return to this topic in class. So now we're going to move into a major category of the theories of motivation, and that is need-based categories. One theory, very important theory, is called two-factor theory. And this was put forth by a guy whose last name was Herzberg. He believed that there are two different kinds of factors in the workplace. One set of factors he called motivators or satisfiers. The other set of factors he called hygiene factors or dissatisfiers. And he said basically what you got to do in the workplace is you've got to make sure that hygiene factors are taken care of, that they're sort of a base level, but they themselves will not cause people to choose to be motivated. That's important. Hygiene factors alone will not cause people to choose to be motivated. It's only the presence of motivating factors that causes people to be motivated. Now let me elaborate just a bit more on that. When hygiene factors are not present to the degree that people want them to be, then the workplace will be very dissatisfying or demotivating. When hygiene factors are where they're supposed to be and motivators are present, well, then we would expect people to choose to be motivated. So hygiene factors include things like company policy, supervision, working conditions, salary, security. The motivators, on the other hand, include achievement, recognition, interesting work, increased responsibility, advancement, and growth. Just consider those two categories and how very different they are. On the right, the motivators, those are really growth-oriented factors. On the left, these are the things that they just got to be there. We've got to make a certain amount of money. We've got to have working conditions that are safe, that are comfortable. I could go on, and I will in class. I'll elaborate on this just a bit more, but hopefully at this point you've got at least a basic understanding of this theory. Need-based theory was crafted by a guy whose last name is McClelland, 1950s, acquired needs. He was most interested in the first of four factors that you see here, need for achievement. He wanted to understand what is it within people that causes them to work really hard to get a lot of things done. And he discovered what he called a need for achievement. And I'll bet most of you have a very high need for achievement. Essentially, it's the desire to accomplish a task more effectively than we've done in the past. Another way of putting this is we want to get stuff done. People with a high need for achievement at the end of the day will consider, what did I all get done today? Did I get a lot of stuff done? And if the answer is yes, well, then they feel pretty good about their day. Now, people with a high need for achievement, in order for them to choose to be motivated, the environment has to include certain components. For example, they have to have challenging goals, but doable goals. They can't be impossible. And the amount of risk that's entailed, that's associated with those goals, needs to be moderate. In other words, it can't be non-existent, nor can it be a high amount of risk. A high amount of risk, well, then people start to think, well, I can't do this. A low amount of risk, people think to themselves, well, anybody could do this. It's not a big deal to have accomplished this. Next, there has to be specific and preferably immediate feedback. The person with a high need for achievement needs that feedback so they know if they're on track with respect to their goals. When they have that very specific and pretty timely feedback, well, then they know if they need to adjust their level of effort. People with a high need for achievement tend to feel personal responsibility for whatever they're doing and ownership for their work and all of the outcomes associated with that. A second need described by McClelland is need for affiliation. He argues here that people need to be around other people. We need human companionship. Now, I'll bet a significant number of you also score high on this particular need. Now, note how I just said that. Essentially, it isn't that one has only one of these needs. Instead, it's that one is on a continuum or a spectrum from low to high for each of these needs. So you're somewhere on the spectrum of low to high for need for achievement, same for need for affiliation. And finally, for the last two, need for personalized power and need for socialized power. You're somewhere on the spectrum from low to high. Now, both of these needs for power get at a desire to control resources, but what differentiates them is the purpose behind that need. So people with a personalized need for power want that control, want that power, want that influence so they can make their own life better. They want higher status, for example. They want more wealth. They want to be able to snap their fingers and have people do their bidding. That's a need for personalized power. A need for socialized power is still a desire to have control, still a desire to have influence, but the reason for wanting that is to serve others, to make a positive difference, for example, in people's lives. That's quite different from wanting status for oneself. Those were the two need-based theories that are important for you to be familiar with, to be knowledgeable about. Now we're going to move into talking about process-based theories. These is equity theory. Basically, we all want the world to be fair. Not equal necessarily, but equitable. As it says here, fairness happens in the workplace, but also outside the workplace, when the outcome to input ratio is similar to the outcome to input ratio of a comparison person, what we call a referent other. So you could create a ratio of your own outcomes to your inputs versus another person, and you choose the person. That's all in your head. They don't choose you, you choose them. Their outcomes to their inputs. Inputs are the contributions that we feel we're making. Outcomes are what we get. So what we get over what we give. Again, what we get over what we give compared to another person, someone we've chosen in our head, what they get compared to what they give. Typically, we're going to pick a referent other who has many characteristics, or at least some critical mass of characteristics in common with us. Someone with whom we share some important characteristics. For example, in the workplace, maybe somebody who has the same title as we do. Someone who's in our department. So what constitutes outcomes? Outcomes include things like pay, perks, things like having a window office, having a special parking spot, opportunities for promotion, praise from one's boss, from others who are significant in the work setting. Those are all gets. Gives or inputs include things like our experience, our expertise, our credentials, how long we've been on the job, our seniority, how much effort, and our age. Now, these are not exhaustive lists. These are illustrative lists. When you look at the inputs, it should be apparent to you that only one of the things listed is something that can be easily adjusted, relatively speaking. The others take time. Have you figured out which one it is? Make sure you have a sense of that for when we meet in class. When people feel as though they're not being treated fairly, they can respond in a variety of ways. They might distort perceptions, for example, change their thinking to believe that the referent, the other person, is actually maybe more skilled than they previously thought. So their inputs are actually higher than the person thought. Maybe we could do something to try and increase our reference inputs. Maybe we try to encourage our referent other to work harder, for example. A pretty common approach is for us to reduce our own input. So just put in less effort, for example. Change the quality of our work so it's not as high as it typically is. We might also try to increase our own outcomes. Maybe go and try and get ourselves a raise. Maybe we end up changing the person with whom we're comparing ourselves. Maybe that will make our lives easier. We might even leave the situation, just quit, to get away from the person, perhaps, that we're consistently comparing ourselves with and coming up short when we make that comparison. Another possibility, if it's not just our perception, but it's perhaps objectively accurate, is to maybe seek legal action. For example, if we perceive that we are offering the same inputs as a referent other, and yet that person is being paid more, perhaps because of their gender, or some other factor that shouldn't, in fact, be weighed when deciding a person's salary, for example, well, then we may seek legal action. Of course, people respond differently to unfairness or inequity. Most people are what we call equity sensitive. So they want equitable relationships. They want those outcome to input ratios to be equal. All right? That's most people. When those ratios aren't equal, equity sensitive folks feel a lot of distress, a lot of dissonance is the word. And this works both ways, whether they feel over rewarded or under rewarded. We'll come back to that in class. Equity benevolence are people who are willing to give more without waiting to receive much in return. In other words, they will have a less than situation in their referent ratio comparison, and they'll be okay with that. Okay, an equity sensitive would not be okay with that, but a benevolent will be. And then you have entitles. Equity entitled, these folks just believe that, yeah, I should be getting more. And when they compare themselves to other people, they want that ratio to be greater than. They want to be greater than their referent other. They think that even if their inputs are the same, they should still be getting, for example, more pay or a better office. Why? Well, just because they're awesome. Not because of anything they've done, not because of any of the inputs. Remember, I'm saying the inputs are the same, essentially, but they still think they should get more. Now, there are other ways to think about equity and fairness. And in fact, this is very important. The notion of justice. The header here says procedural and interactional, but in fact, there are three kinds of justice. The first is distributive. This refers to the degree to which outcomes are perceived to be fair. So, do we feel as though what we're getting is fair? Now I'm talking about beyond just a comparison with one other person, a referent other, but in general, do we feel as though we're being treated well by the organization? Are we getting what we deserve? Are we getting paid well? Do we have good working conditions? Do we get professional development? I could keep going, but you get the point. Are we getting our fair share of what we should be getting? Procedural justice is all about the process that's used to make the decisions that ultimately yield those outcomes. So do we feel as though decision making is fair, that the process used is fair, that the right people are involved in that decision making, that they're thinking about the right criteria, that they're applying the criteria correctly, and so on? And then finally, interactional justice has to do with how we're treated. Do we perceive that within our organization we're treated respectfully, that people are kind to us, that they honor our human dignity? That's very important to people. It goes well beyond people having a need for affiliation, to go back to McClellan's work. This is, as human beings, we expect to be treated kindly. We expect to be treated fairly. We expect that our bosses will see us as human beings, adult human beings, not as children, and that they will treat us accordingly. Second process-based theory of motivation is Vroom's expectancy theory. He argues that motivation, whether we're going to be motivated, how much we're going to be motivated, depends on how much we want something and how likely we think we are to get that thing. So the key components, there are four. The first is valence. This is the degree of attractiveness or unattractiveness, the value that a particular outcome has for a person. Now, key to all of these theories of motivation is understanding that, again, we are not talking about so-called objective reality. We are talking about perception, specifically the perception of the recipient, the perception of the focal person, the perception of the employee or the direct report. So when we talk about a particular outcome, how valuable does the employee think that outcome is? Is it in fact something that they want? A second component of this theory is talking about outcomes, those things that result from performing a behavior. Okay, you might think of this as reward. Next, performance to outcome instrumentality. This is the perceived probability or odds that our performance, assuming we've gotten to the performance level we need to, will actually lead to the outcomes that have been promised. So we reach a certain sales goal, we'll actually get the reward that we've been told we'll receive. So in our minds, we're talking here, instrumentality is about the perceived probability, the odds that we think that will actually happen. And then finally, effort to performance expectancy. This is the perceived probability or odds that effort will lead to performance. In other words, do we think we can work hard enough that we can persist as we need to in order to achieve the goal that's been set for us? Here's what the theory looks like. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more in class about this. But you read this theory, you understand this theory from right to left, not from left to right. So when we're trying to decide how much effort we want to put forward, first thing we think about is, do we care about the reward that's been sort of dangled out there for us? Is it something that has value for us or not? And if it does have value, just how much value? The second thing we think about is instrumentality. Do I think that if I hit my performance goal, I'll actually get that reward? In other words, is this a company that follows through on its promises? When my boss says, if I do X, I'll get Y, is that boss someone who typically follows through on their promises or not? All the time? Some of the time? Are we talking even odds that I'll actually end up getting what was promised to me if I hit the goal? That's what instrumentality is all about. And then finally, expectancy. Do I believe that I can exert enough effort to yield the desired performance? In other words, do I have what it takes to hit the goal that's been put out there for me? Do I have the support I need to make that happen? Can I, in fact, do what I need to do in order to achieve that goal? So, you're a boss, you want to make a difference in terms of people choosing to be motivated. Well, start on the right with valence. Find rewards that are in fact desirable to employees, not just to you, not just the things that have always been given out, but find out what your specific employees want and try to deliver upon that. Make sure that those rewards are viewed as fair. Even, this is better, give employees choice over their rewards. Let them choose from perhaps a cafeteria of options. With respect to instrumentality, you got to make sure you actually reward performance. Don't say you're going to and then choose not to. That's about the worst thing that you can do. Make sure you tell people in advance about the rewards and try to eliminate any sources of non-performance influence over rewards, things that would get in the way of that relationship between performance and rewards. With respect to expectancy, make sure that people, in fact, have the skills, abilities, knowledge they need. You can turn this around to KSA, knowledge, skills, abilities, KSA. Ensure that the environment you've created, in fact, facilitates performance. So you know what that is. Make sure that people have information. Make sure that people have resources. Make sure that people have equipment. Make sure that people have the support they need from you and others. And then encourage your people so that they can believe that their effort will, in fact, make a difference. Be their cheerleader. A final theory that we talk about is reinforcement theory. Now, the guy who came up with this, who at least elaborated upon it in the greatest detail, is B.F. Skinner. And there are 4 elements to this. The first 2 we do as a manager, as a leader, when our employee, when our direct report has done something good. So the person has done something good, and we want them to repeat that good behavior. We have 2 choices. We can either positively reinforce that person, or we can negatively reinforce that person. Notice in both cases we're using the word reinforce. So we are supporting that positive behavior. With positive reinforcement, this is the person's done something good, So we make sure the consequences that follow are good. We maybe praise the employee. With negative reinforcement, the person's done something good. So what we do is we get rid of something negative that would have happened otherwise. We make it so, for example, they don't have to participate in something they really didn't want to participate in. We give them a Friday afternoon off because they've done such a great job. So those are the two things we do if a person is doing good work, and we want them to repeat that behavior. On the other hand, when people do things we don't want them to do again, well, now we have different choices. One is extinction and the other is punishment. With extinction, what we try to do, the person's done something we don't want them to do. We try to figure out what is it that's enabling that behavior? What is reinforcing that bad behavior? What is getting them excited about engaging in that bad behavior? An example of extinguishing could be the manager ignoring the behavior. In other words, not giving the negative behavior any attention, knowing that it's the attention that the employee is going for. So if I choose to simply not give attention to that employee when that person has engaged in bad behavior, if it was my attention that was sort of fueling that bad behavior, well, the argument is that they'll then stop. I'll give another example of this in class. The alternative to extinction, and extinction, by the way, is the best way to stop negative behavior. The alternative, the one that people go to too often, is punishment. Here, we all know what this is. The person's done something bad, so we follow up with negative consequences. The problem with punishment is that it rarely works, at least in any sustainable long-term way. And that's because when people punish, when leaders punish, when parents punish, when coaches punish, when teachers punish, they don't pay attention to the three contextual characteristics that must be true in order for punishment to work. And those contextual characteristics are this. The punishment must be immediate, so it must swiftly follow the negative behavior. It must be intense, as perceived by the individual, and it must be impersonal. So everyone who engages in that behavior must receive the same punishment. And again, that punishment must be immediate. It has to follow closely on the heels of that negative behavior, and it must be intense. Again, I'll talk about in class some examples so that you can see how a lot of what people do to punish others, you'll be able to see why it doesn't in fact work. Talk about reinforcement. So now we're talking about positive and negative reinforcement. So the person's done something good. They've met a sales goal, for example. They've very efficiently taken care of an order that a customer placed. They've dealt with a complaint that a customer had in a very effective fashion. So now we want to reinforce these kinds of behaviors. We want to do something that will enable those behaviors to occur again and again and again. And remember, we might either engage in positive or negative reinforcement. Positive, we're giving them something good. Negative, we're taking away something bad. As it says on this slide at the top, timing is everything. So you can think about different schedules of reinforcement. A continuous schedule, this is where every single time the person does something good, you positively or negatively reinforce them. So there are some examples given there for you on the right. Fixed ratio schedules. Ratio is about frequency of effort. So as it says here, fixed ratio schedules involve providing rewards every however many times that the right behavior is demonstrated. And it's known how many times. So it's every 10 times, every 20 times, every 100 times. Whatever it is, it's every so many times you get some kind of reward. And again, you've got some examples there. One talking about a hair salon, one talking about bonuses that might be given after X number of sales. So it's frequency. And the frequency is fixed. We know how often it will be. Fixed interval schedules, now we're talking about time. So fixed ratio or ratio talks about frequency of effort. Interval talks about time. So with a fixed interval schedule, we're going to provide a reward after a very specific period of time, and that period of time is known. So it's particular times of the year. It's the end of the year bonus. It's the paycheck that you get every 2 weeks or every month or whatever that time period is. It's known. Now, for both ratio and interval, it's also possible to use a variable schedule. So the pattern is not known. The person does not know how often they need to do something, the frequency with which they need to do something, or the time frame that will have to elapse before they are in fact reinforced. Variable ratio, variable interval. So casino slot machines, as it says, pay out on a variable ratio schedule. So you don't know how many times you have to push the button before there's a payout. It could be 10, it could be 13, it could be 3, it could be 1, it could be 75. Nobody knows. The beauty of that, people will keep playing. They'll keep playing because they'll be quite sure, next time, next time, next. They don't really know when it will happen. It's a surprise. Variable interval, basically, whenever the boss happens to be in a good mood, maybe that's when they give out a sales bonus. Nobody knows when that might be. It could be in 2 weeks. It could be in 3 months. It could be who knows when. It's variable. All right, this takes us through the basics of this chapter. As I've mentioned more than once during this narrated PowerPoint, I will touch back on many of these slides, not all of them, but many of them, to provide some very specific examples. In the meantime, make sure that you have carefully read Chapter 5 and taken some notes and thought about your own examples to try and illustrate these different theories. See you in class.